If you haven't caught this series from the beginning, make sure you go back and watch the previous episodes so you can get caught up and find out exactly how we got here. With the playing field created, we can move on and start working on the player. Now, in our case, what we're going to use for the actual player paddle is rather than a kinematic body or character body, we're just going to use a static body 2D because realistically, these are going to be barriers that the ball is going to bounce off of. So we can create our static body 2D. I'm going to call this one player paddle because we're going to be driving it on the left-hand side. And inside of this, we'll kind of do the same thing we did for the background and the rectangle, and we'll just add a color rectangle. This size is really going to depend on exactly how we want our game to function, but in my case, we might want to go with something like 20 by 100. And that's going to give us this really nice kind of basic size paddle. If we look at the actual player paddle static body, we are going to see once again we do not have a collision shape, so we can add that to it. So a simple collision shape 2D, we'll do a rectangle shape, and then inside of this we'll set that to the same 20 by 100. If we zoom in over here though, we'll notice that our colored rectangle and the collision shape aren't actually lining up. For us, that's a really easy fix. On our color rectangle, we can just set our anchor preset to center, and that's going to move it so that way our collision shape and the color rectangle are going to be aligned. We'll then want to set the starting position for the player paddle, and we can go into that transform node and adjust that. So we'll say that it's going to be 128 on the X, and then, somewhere towards the middle, I like to do 264. It's just off center, just a little high, but we'll mirror that and adjust the player 2 paddle here in just a minute. But the only problem with this is that if we run our scene, we can't actually move the paddle. Nothing's actually going to happen here. And we need to create our script to drive the paddle. Now, the script for driving the paddle is actually fairly straightforward. We can start off by attaching a script. That's going to extend our static body 2D. Now, what we want to do here is we want to have controls that's going to allow us to move that paddle up and down. We want that paddle to move at a specific speed that we might define. And we want to make sure that this paddle is going to stay inside of our actual window height in case we make it bigger or smaller, or we leave it the same. To make sure that we can do that, we'll want to define some variables. So we can define our window height, and this is just going to be an integer. We're also going to define our paddle height, which once again will be an integer. And we'll set up a constant for the paddle speed. And we'll actually just set that to a basic value of 500. So right now we have window height, and our paddle speed. The only one that has a value is the paddle speed. To set the other two values of our window height and our paddle height, we can move down to our ready function. We'll clear out our pass, and we can start to define these. Now the window height itself is going to be equal to our viewport size in the Y direction. So to get that, we can get our viewport rectangle. Inside of that, we have a property called size, and then we can specify the Y dimension. So right now it's 648. That's going to pull that value down. We will do a similar thing for our paddle height, to where instead of getting our viewport, we're actually going to get the size of this colored rectangle, and we can get a reference to that just by dragging and dropping. And that will once again be our size.y. So now the second that we launch this scene and we play our game, we are going to get the window height and set it to our viewport size in the Y. And we're going to do the exact same thing with the paddle height, which is going to be the Y dimension of our color rectangle. But we're currently not actually going to do anything with those, and that's where this next step is going to come into play. And that's where we're going to take our inputs. If it's set to an up input, we're going to move our rectangle up. If it's set to a down input, we're going to move the rectangle down, and we're going to make sure that it's between our window height. Before we can do that though, we'll have to go to the project settings, into our input map, and actually define our actions. So we can say player paddle up is one, and we'll say player paddle down is a second one. For our paddle up, we'll go with the W key. And then with the paddle down, we'll go with the S key. This just means when we press W, we're going to expect that the paddle is going to move up. And when we press the S key, the paddle is going to move down. This then allows us back inside of our process function to actually check those inputs. So if our input is action pressed, paddle up. So what we're doing here is we're checking to see if we are pressing the player paddle up input, which is set to our W key, we are going to do something to this. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our position of our player paddle in the Y direction. So taking that Y value of it. And we are going to subtract out our paddle speed times delta. This means that while we're pressing paddle up, we are removing our paddle speed times delta from the position Y, which will effectively move that paddle upwards. We're going to want to do the exact same thing here for the other direction. So instead of if input is action press paddle up, we'll say it's paddle down. And rather than subtracting that value, we can add our value in here. So now, when we play our game, we press the S key, paddle goes down. W key, paddle goes up. But it goes off screen. And that's now finally where we can use our window height and our paddle height. So inside of this process function still, below our inputs, we're going to take our position in the Y direction, and we're going to use a clamp function. Now the clamp function is going to take whatever value we give it. So in this case, we're going to put in our position.y, and we're going to keep it between two specific values. This means that if it ever registers something higher than our max value, it's going to set it to the max value. So we'll take our position.y. We want the minimum value to be our paddle height divided by 2. So at most, the lowest we will ever be is putting the edge of our paddle directly to the top of the screen. And the maximum value, we're going to do a similar thing, but we're going to take our window height, so the overall height of our window, and we're going to subtract out that paddle height divided by 2. This time when we hit play, we go all the way down. No matter how often I'm holding or as much as I'm pressing and slamming that S key, we're going to stay pinned to the bottom, and then same thing up at the top. So now we've effectively made sure that we can never go higher or lower than the actual viewport that we're working on. And this is getting us significantly closer to that finished product of having a playable Pong game. Maybe next we should focus on the ball.